Apollos 2 and 3. After the Apollo 1 tragedy, Apollo 2 was assigned to a previous mission, AS-202, and Apollo 3 was assigned to AS-203. Therefore, the very existence of Apollos 2 and 3 is up for discussion. Apollo 4. This was the 23rd mission and the first to involve a Saturn V, which was an unmanned mission launched from Cape Canaveral on November the 9th, 1967. It was a low Earth orbit mission. Duration of this mission was 9 hours. Apollo 5. This was the 24th mission and the fourth to involve a Saturn 1B, which was an unmanned mission launched on January 22, 1968. It was the first mission to test an unmanned lunar module LM in low Earth orbit, but it should be noted that this particular LEM was structurally incomplete. Therefore, this doesn't qualify as a test on the LM in the actual conditions of spaceflight. Duration of this mission was 11 hours. Apollo 6. This was the 25th mission and the second to involve a Saturn V, another unmanned mission launched on April 4, 1968. It was a low Earth orbit mission. This mission had significant problems with its 5 F1 engines. Duration of this mission was 10 hours. Apollo 7. This was the 22nd mission, the fifth to involve the Saturn 1B and the first manned Apollo mission launched on October the 11th, 1968. Its mission was to test the CM service module SM in the actual conditions in space in low Earth orbit. Duration of this mission was 11 days. Apollo 8. This was the 27th mission launched on December the 8th, 1968. This mission should be considered the most significant of 3 reasons, as it was the first manned, launch of Saturn V, mission to leave low Earth orbit, and mission to circumnavigate the Moon. Up to the launch of Apollo 8, the Saturn V had combined total of only 19 hours of experience in actual conditions of spaceflight, and yet this mission was reported to have been flawless. Duration of this mission was 6 days. Apollo 9. This was the 28th mission and fourth to involve the Saturn V and the second manned mission of the vehicle launched on March 3, 1969. This was the second mission to involve the LM and the first manned mission involving that vehicle. However, this LM should be considered the first test in the conditions of spaceflight since it was a structurally complete version of the vehicle. Duration of this mission was 10 days. Apollo 10. This was the 29th mission, the fifth to involve the Saturn V and the third manned mission of that vehicle, launched on May 18, 1969. It was the second manned mission to leave low Earth orbit to circumnavigate the Moon. It was also the second manned mission of the LEM. While in lunar orbit, the LM separated from the CM. The LM descended to within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface and then aborted the descent to rendezvous and dock back with the CM. This mission was supposed to have been a test run for Apollo 11. Duration of this mission was 8 days. Apollo 11. This was the 30th mission and the sixth to involve the Saturn V and the fourth manned mission of that vehicle, launched on July 16, 1969. It was the third manned mission to leave low Earth orbit to circumnavigate the Moon and involved the first manned lunar landing. Duration of this mission was 8 days. The program continued with Apollos 12 to 17, but the focus of this chapter are the missions leading up to and including Apollo 11. Note: from the 23rd mission on, the duration of each mission of the Apollo series had been rounded off. For the exact durations of these missions, see NASA's website at www.nasa.gov. When one actually studies the details of the Apollo program, it can be seen that, aside from testing of the different components of the Saturn rocket on the ground, there was a minimal amount of testing done of the functional Saturn 1B and Saturn V in the actual conditions of spaceflight before the first manned missions of those vehicles. However, before I talk about the minimal testing of the Saturn V, we must discuss one of the most important aspects of the Saturn V, i.e. the powerful F1 engines. The F1 engines were an integral part of the Saturn V, necessary for the success of an Apollo moon landing mission, and as you'll learn in the next section, the power output of these engines of the Saturn V were overrated. In layman's terms, low F1 engine power means no Apollo moon landings. The overrated power of the FV1 engines. Studies by scientists and engineers outside of the Western engineering and scientific communities that question any aspect of the Apollo missions are usually not publicized in the Western scientific journals or magazines and are, for the most part, ignored. However, it's not so easy to ignore the work of these scientists: Gennady Ivankov, Ph.D., Alexander Popov, Ph.D., Andrei Bolotov, NSG, and S.G. Pogrovsky, Ph.D., in their works. as their work disputes the claim by NASA on the performance of the Saturn V, in particular the F1 engines. The concept of the powerful F1 engines was actually initiated by the Air Force in the 1950s. However, after President Dwight E. Eisenhower established NASA on July 29, 1958, NASA assumed responsibilities for the F1 engines and awarded the contract for design and production to Rocketdyne. One of the main differences between the Saturn 1B and the Saturn V was their lift capabilities. The first stage of the Saturn V contained 5 F1 engines, the second stage contained 5 J2 engines, and the third stage contained 1 J2 engine. The F1 engines gave the Saturn V its heavy lift capabilities and the needed power to propel a significant payload, as in the launch of the hardware necessary for a manned landing on the Moon. Without the F1 engines, the Apollo missions could not have happened, and in fact, that is exactly what is claimed by former Rocketdyne employee Bill Kaysing over 40 years ago. Minimal testing of the F1 engines. Rocketdyne had done static testing of the F1 engines, but it's difficult to ascertain just how many of these static tests were done. I contacted the MSFC for documents regarding static tests of the F1 engine and was provided with a link to their technical documents. I researched through 300 documents and found out about the F1 engine, but nothing as to the number of static tests that were conducted. I contacted the National Archives but got no precise information there either. I then decided to contact Rocketdyne, now called Aerojet Rocketdyne, when I found www.thespacereview.com. Their stated purpose. The Space Review is an online publication devoted to in-depth articles, commentary, and reviews regarding all aspects of space exploration, science, technology, policy, business, and more. A posted article on their website about the F1 engines has this to say: the long-standing story that NASA lost or destroyed the Saturn V plans quickly falls to pieces when one learns about the F1 production knowledge retention program. This was a project at Rocketdyne, the company that built the F1 engine, to preserve as much technical documentation about the engine as was possible. This produced about 20 volumes of material on topics such as the engine's injector ring set valves, engine assembly and checkout, and thermal insulation and electrical cables, among others. In fact, lost or destroyed Saturn V documents only add to the suspicion that NASA is hiding something, since these are the very rockets that use the F1 engines. The author of this article, Dwayne A. Day, then says the goal was to preserve as much technical documentation and knowledge about the F1 engines as was possible. If that were the case, why not preserve all of it? Day then describes the testing of the F1 engine. Rocketdyne delivered 98 production engines to NASA, of which 65 were launched. A total of 56 equivalent development engines were tested. The company conducted 2,771 production and R&D firing tests in single engines, 1,100 total full-duration tests, and accumulated 239,124 seconds over 66 hours of engine firing experience. The 5-engine cluster used on the Saturn V was fired at the Mississippi and Alabama test facilities 34 times, with 18 full-duration tests for a total of 15,534 seconds of engine experience. Rocketdyne estimated in 1992 that the F1 engine development program had cost $1.77 billion in FY91 dollars. Dwayne Day also used large numbers to emphasize that there were many tests of the F1 engines, which when translated, the combined production and R&D firing tests of single engines and full-duration tests of F1 engines was over 66 hours. The 5-engine cluster test of the F1 engines was 4 hours in total. There was a combined total of 70 hours of static tests of the F1 engines, which seems adequate given the duration of each engine cluster after launch, purportedly used in all Apollo missions, which was approximately 2 minutes. This included 35 engine cluster tests, 18 of which were full-duration tests. However, the amount of static testing means little or nothing unless there is a comparable testing of the F1 engines in actual spaceflight conditions, which is equally, if not more important, for evaluating engine performance, and as you'll see, testing in the unmanned Saturn V missions was nowhere near standards and were minimal to say the least. But before we discuss the overall testing of the F1 engines in spaceflight conditions, we take a look at some of the disturbing test practices before these engines were assigned to their particular mission. I have chosen these 4 missions for their historical significance in the Apollo programs to highlight this. Apollo 4. The first test firing was on February the 17th, and the program duration of just under 41 seconds met all of the test objectives. Another test was conducted on February 25th, but a red line observer reacted to an incorrect reading by ending the test 83.2 seconds into the planned duration of 128 seconds. The incorrect reading proved to be due to a faulty transducer. After analysis of the results, it was decided that the full duration test would not be needed. S1C1 was refurbished, subjected to a number of inspections and checks by MSCF's laboratories, loaded on the seagoing barge Poseidon, and shipped to KSC. It became the first stage of AS501, which was launched unmanned as Apollo 4 on November 9, 1967. The first test firing of these engines of Apollo 4 was conducted on February 17 and 25, 1966. These F-1 engines were then stored at the Kennedy Space Center KSC for a year and 8 months before they were used on Apollo 4, and that is without any further testing of these engines. This mission seemingly worked flawlessly. Apollo 6. SIC-2 was installed on the static test stand at MSCF in May 1966. The first test firing on June 7, 1966 lasted for 123.3 seconds. However, on the F-1 engines on this stage, F4017 showed thrust anomalies. After being removed, it was inspected, refurbished, and subjected to 3 further individual tests during which it functioned satisfactorily. It was reinstalled at SIC-2 in August. Refurbishment, inspection, and checkout of the stage by several of MSFC's laboratories took several months. It was then loaded on board the barge Poseidon, shipped to KSC in March 1967, and became the first stage of AS502, which was launched unmanned as Apollo 6. Apollo 6 was launched April 4, 1968, almost 2 years after the recorded test of its F-1 engines. This mission experienced problems with its F-1 engines during launch, which will be discussed in detail further below. Apollo 8. The first SIC to be manufactured by Boeing at the Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana was SIC-3, and it was the final stage tested at MSFC. It was shipped by the barge Poseidon from Michoud to MSFC and placed on the static test stand on November 3, 1966. The first test on November 15, 1966 lasted for 121.7 seconds. The stage was removed from the stand on November 21st and returned to Michoud. After refurbishment, engineer change orders, and system checks, NASA accepted it for shipment to KSC. On arrival there on December 27, 1967, it was placed in storage. It became the first stage of AS503, which was to be the third unmanned test flight of the Saturn V. But when this was cancelled, the vehicle was used for Apollo 8, the first manned mission which flew out to orbit around the Moon. The F-1 engines were stored for over a year without any further testing before they were used to launch Apollo 8, and in just 7 months the problems that plagued Apollo 6 were resolved before the first manned mission of Apollo 8, which was seemingly flawless. Apollo 11. On March 1, 1968, SICS arrived at the Mississippi Test Facility on the barge Pearl River. It was installed in the B-2 stand on March 4th and subjected to months of checkout and tests. Finally, on August 13th, it was fired for a planned 125 seconds. All F-1 engines performed within their performance parameters. This test was particularly significant due to the inclusion of the POGO suppression system added after Apollo 6 suffered from the longitudinal oscillations when launched on April 4th. Following the post-fire checks, the stage was returned to Michoud on August 28th for refurbishment, modification, and checkout. On 16 February 1969, it was loaded onto the barge Orion for shipment to KSC, where it arrived 4 days later. SIC-6 is perhaps the most historically significant of the Saturn V first stages because it was stacked as SA-506 and launched as Apollo 11, the mission that achieved Kennedy's challenge of landing men on the Moon. It seems that there were no more test firings of the F-1 engines after August 1968, which was touted to be the most historically significant mission in the Apollo program, as well as the greatest scientific achievement of the 20th century. The previous 4 quotes are from the same book on the F-1 engine. In a review of that book, Jeff Faust has this to say: Young relies on a combination of primary sources, including NASA and Rocketdyne documents, as well as oral interviews with people who worked on the F-1 engines, who provided additional insights and anecdotes that cannot be found in the original documentation. Contrary to what Dwayne A. Day has to say regarding the F-1 production knowledge retention program, it's apparent that decades later, it's up to people who worked on the F-1 engines to fill in the missing data from incomplete documents. Further, as mentioned earlier, it is the lost or destroyed Saturn V documents that are needed to substantiate any of the data related to F-1 engine static tests. In addition, NASA knew that in the early 1960s that the F-1 engines were not up to the task of launching the required Apollo hardware for a manned lunar landing. Former Rocketdyne employee Bill Kaysing exposes the F-1 fraud. The first person to expose the F-1 fraud and simultaneously the Apollo moon hoax was Bill Kaysing, who published a book on it in 1976. Bill Kaysing was an employee of Rocketdyne and had direct access to the documents pertaining to the F-1 engine tests. He was an employee of Rocketdyne from 1956 to 1963, a period which coincides with the first static tests of the F-1 engine. Wikipedia. Kaysing began work as a senior technical writer at Rocketdyne starting on February 13, 1956. On September 24, 1956, he became a service analyst. Starting September 15, 1958, he worked as a service engineer, and starting on October 10, 1962, as a publications analyst. On May 31, 1963, he resigned for personal reasons. Trained as neither an engineer nor a specialist, he nevertheless also served as the company's head of technical publications during his time from 1956 to 1963 at Rocketdyne, a division of North American Aviation, and from 1967 of Rocketdyne International, where the Saturn V rocket engines were designed and built. Bill Kaysing's decision to resign from Rocketdyne had a lot to do with what he saw in the F-1 engine's documents. And aside from the fact that Kaysing was not trained as an engineer nor a specialist, as Wikipedia is quick to point out, it's apparent that Rocketdyne was impressed enough with his expertise to hire him to analyze reports. It follows that Kaysing was more than qualified to read technical documents and evaluate data regarding the F-1 engines. During his employment at Rocketdyne, Kaysing claims to have seen evidence in these documents that the F-1 engines of the Saturn V were not capable of producing the power output needed to launch the Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit for the lunar missions. This is significant since NASA, after much debate, adopted the method of Lunar Orbit Rendezvous (LOR) for a lunar landing, which required NASA to launch the Apollo lunar hardware as well as the astronauts in one mission, as opposed to launching the lunar hardware in a separate mission. This, of course, would have required the purported heavy lift capabilities of the F-1 engines in the Saturn V. Kaysing had been criticized and ridiculed over the decades, and sometimes in less obvious ways, as with the Wikipedia quote above. However, Kaysing was never deterred, and for the last several decades, he maintained his claims that the real power output of the F-1 engines was far less than NASA claimed. Bill Kaysing writes, "From the date of the decision to simulate, the modified hardware program was conducted. For example, the Saturn C5 moon rocket assembly was built to specifications with one major modification. Instead of total unreliable F-1 engines, the 5 rocket engines of the more dependable B-1 type as used in the C-1 cluster for the Atlas missile were used. Although a cluster of B-1 engines produced only one half of the output of the single F-1 engine chamber, the power, that is, 750,000 pounds of thrust, was sufficient to launch the virtual empty Apollo vehicle. If the rocket had been in its design form, it would have weighed 6 million pounds, or 300 tons fully loaded. This is the weight of a U.S. naval destroyer, further pointing out the total impracticality of the venture. However, by eliminating every aspect of the moon voyage, fuel, heavy machines, LEM vehicles, etc., the total weight of modified, short-range, simulated voyage Apollo was less than 1/20th of the original, or about 150 tons. This loading was well within the capabilities of the B-1 propulsion units. Also, since the originally planned 2 million parts were reduced to a mere 150,000 gadgets, the success of the limited mission was virtually assured. However, even the C-1 Atlas engines were known to explode on the pad or shortly following launch. Thus, the escape module for the astronauts was left intact and functioning. If there had been an accidental loss of thrust or other mishap, it would have been simple to have the saved astronauts merge from the escape module after its recovery. Note: to clarify, the C5 was eventually changed to the Saturn V. Bill Kaysing may have gotten some of the details in his book wrong, for example the actual mechanics of the modified Saturn V, but his overall point that the F1 engines did not have the heavy lift capabilities that has recently been substantiated by the previous mentioned scientists Ivankov, Popov, Bultov, and Progrovsky. It's obvious that what Bill Kaysing initially saw in these F1 engines documents was either deleted from the record or the original documents have gone missing, and since the power output of the Saturn V engines were not what NASA had claimed, they, by inference, NASA fabricated future documents, that is, if any of this data even existed. Engineer Gennady Ivchenkov, Ph.D., substantiates Bill Kaysing's claims. Gennady Ivchenkov published a 55-page article on the performance of the F1 engine. His premise is that the combustion chamber of the F1 engine was unstable, meaning that the F1 engine could not have used its full power potential. Gennady Ivchenkov writes, "The question of whether the Saturn V rocket engineers corresponded to NASA's stated characteristics is directly related to the Apollo moon hoax. Did the Americans really go to the moon in 1969-72, or was it an elaborate hoax? This question was raised initially by the Americans themselves, almost immediately after the Apollo missions. Over the years, a considerable amount of direct and indirect evidence has come to light that at least some of the missions were in fact staged. One of the aspects of this indirect evidence Ivchenkov talks about is NASA's marketing publications, in which chief designers of the Soviet space industry had no trouble deciphering what the actual power output of the F1 engines was, not as NASA claimed. Further, as Ivchenkov says, it is only recently that documents have become available that contradict the claims made by NASA. So, it seems that some of the original data for the F1 engines did exist and did survive, validating Bill Kaysing's claims. For the general public, there are sources of information in technical books and articles detailing the different aspects of the Saturn V and its F1 engines. However, one should be cautious as to the reliability of any of the data in these sources. Regarding quotations, all technical information in North America, including technical guidelines, manuals, instructions, etc., is written by so-called technical writers who put the available material into literary form accessible to the public. It's just a job, something like a journalist writing on technical subjects. It is easy to distort the source material. 7 inconsistencies for the F1 records are noted later in this article. Therefore, all numbers and technical data in such documents should be treated with caution. Note: many journalists have written on technical matters and have done so accurately in accessing documents where necessary. However, it would be incumbent on the reader to carefully check the financial backing and sources of any of the numerous investigative journalists who publish such material. Proponents of the Apollo missions are quick to point out that these documents can be accessed at various online sites such as MFFC, NASA, and the National Archives, but many of these documents are incomplete or are missing, and any of these documents that still exist could easily be translated and published into books placed in public libraries as well as being stored away, example, in the National Archives. Also, a lot of these technical books are based on interviews conducted decades later with personnel who were involved with the Apollo missions and rely more on memory since documents are either incomplete or missing. Regarding the F1 thruster chamber, the thrust chamber body provides a combustion chamber for burning propellants to generate pressure and an expansion nozzle to expel the combustion gases at high velocity to produce thrust. The combustion chamber of the F1 engine produced thrust nearly 10 times greater than any previous rocket engine. The temperature of the combustion chamber extension reached 5,900 degrees Fahrenheit and thus needed to be cooled. The material that cooled the combustion chamber was provided by tubes running along the combustion chamber walls. The tubing material needed to be strong enough to withstand the thrust force, yet light enough to minimize the overall weight of the Saturn V. Fuel enters the fuel inlet manifold through 2 inlets set 180 degrees apart. From the manifold, 70% of the fuel is diverted through 89 alternating corrosion-resistant steel down tubes the length of the chamber. A manifold at the nozzle exit returns the fuel through the remaining 89 up tubes to supply the injector. A manifold at the nozzle exit returns the fuel through the remaining 89 up tubes to supply the injector. The fuel flowing through the tubes provides regenerative cooling of the chamber walls during engine operation. It is the material used to make these tubes that cause the combustion chamber instability. As the analysis of Vichenkov's article shows, the source gives the thickness of the F1 tubes as 0.475 millimeters, the accuracy of which is highly questionable, since such a wall thickness contradicts the cooling requirements. The combustion chamber tubes were made of thin-walled tubes of nickel alloy Inconel X750, which differ from what was used in the seemingly successful H1 engines in the Saturn 1B. As Vicchenkov explains, when using Inconel 750, this material could not have withstood the pressures and temperatures produced by the F1 engine thrust. In this case, the combustion chamber thrust would have been throttled back, which means the Saturn V could not have lifted the necessary Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit for a manned moon landing mission. A NASA report regarding a static test of the F1 engine in 1959, as quoted in Vichenkov's article, shows that the F1 engine did indeed produce the necessary thrust, but with a catch. In January 1959, Rocketdyne's NASA contract included requirements for a series of feasibility firings of the new F1 booster. 2 months later, the engine hinted at its future success with a brief main-stage ignition. The trial run demonstrated stable combustion for 200 milliseconds and achieved a thrust level of 5 million newtons, 1 million pounds. In conducting these tests, Rocketdyne used a solid-wall boilerplate thrust chamber and injector, a far cry from flight hardware, but the unheard-of mark of 4,500,000 newtons or 1 million pounds of thrust had been reached by a single engine. The catch being the sustained static test firing did not match the duration of the Apollo launch up to the separation of the first stage of Saturn V, which contained the F1 engines. This is an important point to remember, keeping in mind the actual conditions of spaceflight. This is obviously an example of what Bill Kaysing was talking about when he stated that the F1 engine's firing tests could not be sustained.